Yeah, akathisia. People call it, how do I best describe it? And I wonder how your dad described it, but people call it the epitome of losing their mind, basically, because they are unable to control the thoughts that they have. It's not just that, it's also a physical restlessness. So a kind of inner turmoil and a physical restlessness. So people pace, they can't control their jerks, their movements. It's probably one of the most horrible conditions that anybody can find themselves in. And people commit suicide or die by suicide for two reasons when it comes to akathisia. So the first one is that they have no control over their mind, and their mind is literally telling them to kill themselves. The second is that it becomes so painful and so unbearable that they feel that they have no option.
Welcome to the Mikhaila Peterson podcast, episode 125. In this episode, Beverley Thomson joined me to discuss prescription medications like antidepressants and their effects on those who depend on them. I debated whether or not to release this episode because I don't want to absolutely terrify people. Antidepressants are a completely misunderstood medication that cause dependence, and people aren't aware of it, so I'm going to release it anyway. This is serious. For me, after being on SSRIs specifically from the ages of 12 to 23, coming off of them caused me severe depression, sensitivity to sound, light, touch, temperature, and visual hallucinations. The worst symptom was a feeling of overwhelming doom and panic. Those symptoms are a huge part of the reason I had to go to a zero-carb diet. I got sensitive to carbs as well, sugars, chemicals, everything. It was to mitigate antidepressant withdrawal. However, I do believe there's hope for people on them. I got off of mine and through the withdrawal, and I'm doing fine now. I don't have withdrawal anymore. I'm putting out this video because people need to know of the dangers of these medications. Going low carb and then zero carb was insanely beneficial to me getting off of these. I don't know how I would have done it without that. Don't lose hope if you're on them, and don't suddenly stop taking them, which is what I did. Talk to your doctor, do your research. This is just an episode to help bring awareness to the dangers of these medications, particularly upon sudden cessation. My guest, Beverley Tompson, is a writer, researcher, and speaker with a focus on psychiatric medication like antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and ADHD meds. Beverley has intensely studied how these medications work, their history, side effects, potential for dependence, and the effects of withdrawal. Beverley's worked with the British Medical Association, the Scottish Government, and the UK Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry. She drew a lot from those experiences to write Antidepressed, a breakthrough examination of epidemic antidepressant harm and dependence. Remember to hit subscribe if you learn anything or enjoy this content. Beverley Tompson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Before we get started, could you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you. I am a writer and a researcher, and for the past 10 years, I have been researching psychiatric medication. My particular area of interest is antidepressants, in particular adverse effects, dependence, withdrawal, and prescription drug-induced suicide, particularly amongst the young. I have worked with organisations such as the BMA, the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry, and the Scottish Government. And I've contributed to articles in the BMJ and in mainstream media.
Okay, how did you get started doing this work?
My interest really started about 15 years ago when I was working in a counselling role in schools. And I started to notice that the language around the children was starting to change. And I started to notice people were starting to say things like, there's something wrong with him, or I think he's got ADHD, and I started to question why we were suddenly blaming children or their brain chemistry a lot of the time for how their ability to cope with what were often very, 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 serious life situations or family situations or things that they were dealing with at school. And that's really where my interest began.
Okay, so you started with kids.
Yeah, I started with kids.
Okay, so do you know how our mental health started going into the pharmaceutical industry rather than being attributed to life problems? Do you know the background about how that happened?
Sure. I mean, it all started with Prozac in 1988, and the mental health monster was born. I mean, I was in 1988. By 2000, I think it was Eli Lilly, a third of its £3 billion profit came from the drug Prozac. So the medical profession were taught at that time through various campaigns like Defeat Depression and Depression Hurts, that all of a sudden we had a chemical imbalance, and this chemical imbalance was what needed to be treated. So it was a chemical imbalance in our brain. So suddenly everything that was going wrong and our inability to cope with life was our fault. So once SSRI drugs were introduced into society, we basically bought into the idea that we had a chemical imbalance and we needed a drug. We needed a drug to fix it, to fix us.
Okay, so that was 1988. So this is rather recent.
Yeah, 1988 was the first SSRI antidepressant.
So this idea of a chemical imbalance, do you know where that came from? Like how that theory even evolved?
Yeah, well, it came from psychiatry. So psychiatry have been very good at manipulating how we treat our mental health. So they have a book called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. And I call it probably the most influential book that somebody's never heard of. It has at the moment, I think, over 300 diagnoses in it that we can be given in order to be prescribed drugs or medication to help us cope with things. So those terms like OCD and GAD and bipolar were created by psychiatry, passed on to our primary care so that they could diagnose us and they could treat us with drugs. It's pretty simple, really.
Okay. So I want to talk a bit about, I've talked about this on my podcast a couple of times because I had horrifying withdrawal and really terrible side effects that I wasn't aware of because I was prescribed SSRIs at a young age. So let's start off with, do you know percentage wise, is most of your research based out of Scotland, or do you know percentages for America? Because I think America might be hit almost the hardest with the pharmaceutical, whatever's going on in psychiatry.
Yeah, I do quote some statistics in my book. And yes, North America, I think there are at the moment about 45 million people who are taking antidepressants and 2.1 million children, which is a huge number. And of course, because of the pandemic, the rates have increased sometimes, something between, at one point it was reported 20% increases, and for other drugs up to 40.
Oh man. Okay. So do you have any idea what happens to the brain when people are on these medications for extended periods of time?
Well, that's a problem. We really don't. And I think I heard your father say once in a podcast that we're randomly guessing. And that's pretty accurate. Everything to do with these drugs always comes with a caveat. And if you see things in a medical journal or in research, it always says, it is thought that. Because we don't really know. I mean, the chemical imbalance theory has been tested for 40 years and it is still unproven. But saying that, the medical profession are still repeating it nonstop. I'll give you is it okay if I give you an example?
Yeah, for sure.
One this week on mainstream TV with an something called This Morning, which is a program that's in the morning on TV in the UK, and it has around 2 million viewers every morning. And a GP, who is the GP for the program, came on and just this week was talking about antidepressants. She quoted the chemical imbalance theory. She quoted that the drugs are just like taking a drug for diabetes.
Yeah.
She quoted that they can be taken long term and it's better if people do it. So what we're fighting against, even though a lot of research has been done to prove that a lot of things are myths, the medical profession, backed by psychiatry and pharmaceutical industry, really don't want to buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about, my audience is pretty familiar, but like I said, I was on antidepressants. I was on Cipralex from the age of 12 till 23. And I stopped taking it over a period of 2 weeks, and it was absolutely horrific. And I had no idea what was going on. And I managed to ameliorate some of the withdrawal by going low carb and like not being around loud noises and bright lights. But it was horrifying. And it took me 2.5 years to figure out that, that was from abruptly stopping antidepressants. So could you talk a bit? And so part of the reason I'm talking about it is because I've seen this happen to a lot of people, and they're told it's their underlying condition that's popping back up. And they're not aware that, oh no, this can be actual withdrawal from a dependence you didn't know you had on a medication you were told you needed that was safe. So that's why I talk about this. But can you give me some examples of what you've seen as common side effects of, say, weaning or suddenly stopping these antidepressants?
Well, first of all, I have to say that nobody should ever stop taking antidepressants cold turkey. They should always take it with the advice of a medical professional or a support service. And that's another issue that I hope we can talk about because, they don't exist. As you know, when you were looking for one with your father. So the problem is that when this imbalance is, we're told that these drugs cure a chemical imbalance, but what they actually do is they create an imbalance. So you have basically become, you are in a new balanced state. So this drug puts you in a new balanced state, which affects you psychologically, physiologically, and it affects every single part of your being. It's not just about the brain. So when you suddenly, and it can happen just missing one dose, and this is probably the first time that people realize that they're dependent on the drugs. And there are, of these 45 million people, most people will be dependent and actually not realize it. If they've taken the drugs for anything over, sometimes just 6 months, people can become dependent. So what happens is once you start to decrease, your body goes, hey, something not right here. And what happens is basically you're starting to become unbalanced again. So that new state that your body and your mind have become used to suddenly goes, oh, don't know where I am right now, don't know what I'm dealing with. And that's where the withdrawal effects come from. So basically a lot of the withdrawal effects are neurological effects. So it can start with things like brain zaps, feeling sick, you can have tremors, you can have increased anxiety. If you look, you can actually have all the things that are listed in the adverse effects. So if you look at a patient information leaflet for an SSRI drug, you won't be surprised, I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that there are about 50 that are listed as common, 50 adverse effects, and there are about 140 that are listed as uncommon or rare. Now, these uncommon or rare ones are not uncommon or rare, and you'll be surprised to hear that drug dependence is actually listed as uncommon.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So, they want us to keep taking these drugs. And the problem is that because we are in this new balanced state, every time we try to reduce, we think that we're ill again. Now, it would be very, 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 very hard for you to suddenly go back to that state that you were in when you first started taking the drug. If you think about the position that you were in then, you might have lost your job, you might have been in a relationship breakup, you might have had lots of, financial problems. But how can you be suddenly going back to the same state that you were in? So withdrawal is a huge problem. And for many people, if they read my book, they will realize that many people are not ever going to be able to stop taking these drugs and return to their normal state. And that's seriously worrying. And that's why we need education, and we need people, especially young people, to start to realize if you choose to take these drugs, and you have every right to take a drug if you want to take one, you need to be informed. You need to take it for no longer than 6 months if you want to. If you want to reduce the harm that these drugs can do. Everybody has a right to take them if that's what they do, but they also have a right, they need to be an informed patient. One thing that I was watching your dad's podcast that you did with him, and I think everybody should watch it. It's really, really interesting. But, he said a few things, and he said, I should have known these things. He said, why the hell didn't I see this coming? And he said, I didn't understand until I started to decrease. Mm-hmm. That is just the same as everyone else. Mm-hmm. They think these drugs are saving their lives. They think that they can't survive without them. But the ironic thing is actually they are getting to a point probably where they can't survive without them.
Yeah, it sounds like such a conspiracy theory. Like if you're not aware, it sounds like such a conspiracy theory. So I'd never heard of antidepressant withdrawal at all. I didn't know that they were dependence forming at all. And I had been actively told that they weren't. And so I hardly ever missed a dose, but if I ever missed a dose, I was like, oh, it's the bipolar coming back. So that horrible feeling, I was like, that's my underlying insanity. Yeah. Right. And that's what I thought. It wasn't until and it really did take like 2.5 years after I stopped taking them to realize that it was drug withdrawal. But I would say people should be very aware. And I talked in another episode that there aren't studies done, I believe, over 8 weeks of people on any psychiatric medication, which is crazy for health professionals to say you can take it long-term safely because there aren't any studies. And then I've known a lot of people who've used ways to taper down gradually and get off of them. But unfortunately, like the hard reality is, I think especially you can talk about this actually about the age difference for when you're young or when you're old. But I know that the percentage of elderly people who are on these medications, especially in nursing homes, is super high. And those people probably aren't getting off of these. So it's definitely, education is definitely needed. Have you seen, like, say this is something you start, because like I got off of everything and I'm okay now, but it was the worst experience I've ever had for years, every day. So do you have ways, let's talk about first ways that you've learned of in order to at least reduce the dose you're on or potentially reduce the dose? Let's start with that.
Okay. Well, the problem is that as you rightly say, there are no studies that have been done in terms of how to reduce. What we have are a few guidelines, very inadequate guidelines, actually. The American Psychiatric Association has a guideline that hasn't been updated since 2010. And we urgently need that to change. So what we're finding is that the best advice is actually anecdotal evidence, and the best way we can learn is from anecdotal evidence. So we have at the moment what must be hundreds of thousands of people who are in sites online trying to support each other through this actual process because there are no guidelines from professionals. What I talk about in my book is something called harm reduction. I compare it to suddenly getting up one day and trying to run a 26-mile marathon. You can't do it. It's impossible. But what you have to do is prepare yourself for it. The only thing we know is time is your best friend. So by harm reduction, what I mean is what this means is that you can't view it as an all or nothing thing, because some people, as I said, will never be able to get off these drugs. Never. Some people will be able to reduce and manage their dosage over time. But nobody should go into it believing that they are actually going to be able to come off these drugs 100%. So time, dose reduction, there are some fantastic sites. There's some fantastic literature, and I have a really, really detailed resource section in my book. Because one thing that I wanted to do was inform people. And I think that was another thing that your dad said. He wanted to inform people so they don't go through this. That was, my book is not a medical book. It's not an academic book. It's written in a very plain language that means that people can pick it up, they can dip in and out, they can take the information they need, and they can become informed about this subject, which is really what we need everybody to do.
Yeah. I would also say to reduce some of the fear, because like you said, some people can't get off of this, which I believe is true, especially with age and length of time and dosage. But there are definitely ways, at least that I've found, to help with side effects and to keep things stable. But freaking out, being like, okay, I'm dependent on a drug and I didn't mean to get dependent and I need to get rid of it. And then getting rid of it too quickly can be completely disastrous and can end up killing people. Like make life so miserable that it kills people. So don't do that. This episode is brought to you by Paleo Valley's 100% grass-fed beef sticks. Paleo Valley is a great company that's doing amazing things for people's health. They're committed to making high-quality, clean products free of problematic ingredients and farming practices that don't harm the environment. Their products come from small family-owned farms right here in the USA that use rotational grazing. If you want to look that up, I'm going to Oxford to debate on this actually. Rotational grazing is the bomb diggity. It's what people should do for farming. Their cows are never fed grains or harmful antibiotics either. So if you avoid meat for environmental reasons and you're still watching me for some reason, you're going to love Paleo Valley's grass-fed and finished beef sticks. Now, you've probably heard some of the tricks companies use for product taglines. Did you know that companies can claim their beef is grass-fed as long as it was fed grass at some point in its life? Or that meat can be marked American-made, even if only packaged in America? Paleo Valley, on the other hand, is the real deal. I personally can't eat these because of my lamb diet. But if you guys are snacking on pepperoni sticks or something, or need a snack that's actually a healthy option, need to lose some weight, this is a great option. There are no preservatives, no fillers, just 100% American, 100% grass-fed and finished beef from domestic regenerative farms with organic spices. I can't eat it because I don't eat spices, but my brother is a huge fan. So check them out. I wouldn't be advertising them if I didn't support this kind of product. You can help your body and the environment by trying Paleo Valley's high quality protein today. Just head over to paleovalley.com and enter code MP for 15% off your first order. That's paleovalley.com with code MP for 15% off your first order. Can we talk a bit about, say, alternatives to medication if there are people who aren't on medication?
Yeah, and I think, the one thing that we have to try and do now is realize that we are being treated for conditions that are not actually medical conditions. So we need to start looking at ways, and I quote Daniel Pouras, who is a an ex-UN special rapporteur who has done a lot about the ways that we should start to think about mental health nowadays. And it's about social prescribing. It's about, support. It's about going back to looking at it in terms of addressing the issues that are making it difficult to cope with our lives, and not about taking drugs that are to create to cure a chemical imbalance. I think he talks about we need to address personal and societal factors and not address chemical imbalances. And I think that's the way that we have to go. So, things like people need to start looking at alternatives. They have to look at their diet. They have to look at less social time on social media. They have to look at their exercise. They have to take up a hobby. I mean, not everybody can do these things, but if we can, it certainly is a great alternative to becoming antidepressed.
Yeah. It's also effective, right? So for me and for my dad, one of the things that was confusing about being diagnosed with depression is there weren't aspects of our lives. Exactly. There were some, but there weren't major aspects that were completely out of place. So relationship was solid, job was solid. So those are two areas that can cause depression. I was quite ill as a child with an autoimmune disorder, and that was really stressful for my family. But dad's depression started before I was born. Wow. So that ended up being entirely, I would say, caused by diet and his response to diet. And so it could have been ameliorated by diet. So if people have looked into different areas of their life, so like relationships, job, money, and if there are problems there you can fix, go there. And if nothing seems out of place and you're still miserable, then you have to start looking at your health, because inflammation can be a cause of depression, and antidepressants aren't going to fix the underlying problem. They're just going to Band-Aid it. And even then, they don't, like, me being on them, I remember it felt like they helped initially, but then I was numb and depressed, and it was better than just being depressed and feeling that raw emotion, but it did not pay off in the end. The end was terrible. So there are ways you can get around it. Yeah.
Yeah. And most people, if you think about it, most of us, if we think about it realistically, we can probably work out the things in our lives that are making it difficult for us to cope with life. And it doesn't mean that we all have the ability to deal with them, but things like, I know in the States, for example, there's a huge lack of access to psychological therapy. There's a huge lack of counselors. There's a lack of psychiatrists and psychologists. And these issues really seriously need to address. But you don't have to talk to a professional. And actually, it doesn't have to be a conversation about your mental health. It can just be a conversation about your life and how you're feeling. And that's a huge start.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And if you're not comfortable talking to someone, you can also write. Like some people who are super introverted, you just try and write out what's making you not feel good in your head. Like, here are the problems. Even just identifying the problems can help you work on them.
Yeah, I think so. And not everybody can access things. And we have major problems. And one of the problems in the States, I think, that is a huge problem, especially for elderly people, is loneliness. And how do we deal with this? But most people, elderly people who are lonely, are being prescribed antidepressants. And we have to stop this. This is not good for people who need our care and our love to be prescribing them mind-altering drugs at a time when they're most vulnerable.
What are the alternatives then for say the elderly and for this loneliness? Because I'm full on, I'm pretty antidepressants after what happened to me. But for the sake of the argument, like, say you're dealing with older people, and their family isn't caring for them, and they're in old folks' homes and they're unhappy. Like, that would mean an entire system overhaul. which how are we supposed to do that?
Well, that's a very good question. How are we supposed to do that? And it is a society issue. But the more the mental health monster, the mental health messages aren't keeping us healthy at all. Disability rates are shooting through the roof. And this is because we have bought into this fact that whatever age we are, if we have problems coping, we're mentally ill. It's a difficult one because it is societal changes that are needed. It's not individual changes. We can support more, but some people just don't have somebody there and they depend on society to help them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Children especially as well. I think we have to start asking the question, is it morally the right thing to do to medicate children with mind-altering drugs? Do we have the right to do that?
So when I agree, especially with things like ADHD and especially with things like ADHD, but this is the position my parents were in, because I've had a lot of people and they're like, well, why were you put on something at the age of 12? And so, which ended up really not doing me well, in the end, when I stopped taking it abruptly. But at the time they were dealing with somebody with an autoimmune disorder, and I was having OCD tendencies to try organizing things late into the night, extreme anxiety, night terrors. And I wouldn't say suicidal ideation, but I was getting to the point where I was like, maybe it'd be better if I was dead. And that could have been, and I've tried to figure it out, right? And it could have been partly a response to being sick, and it could have been the inflammatory response my body was provoking. But in that period of time, when we were unaware that diet played such a major factor, it was like, what do we do? She can't survive like this. Here's a medication. And so I guess education is what's needed, that there are alternatives. So, yeah.
And I think the problem is that most parents have already bought into the fact that just like them, their children probably have a chemical imbalance that needs correcting. So they've already bought into this narrative, and they see no reason why their children shouldn't be medicated too. But I do feel sorry for parents, because they're kind of, in a lot of cases, damned if they do and damned if they don't. But the one thing that we do need to start looking at is the suicide rate for children who are prescribed antidepressants is, skyrocketing, and I think they're twice as likely, 2.5 times as likely to have a suicidal event as unmedicated children.
Okay, that's definitely something we should touch on then.
Yeah.
So I guess the other side of the argument would be, well, aren't those children already more inclined towards suicide attempts without the medication? And so how do we know that it's the medication that's increasing this suicidal ideation?
Yeah, there are a number of robust studies that have been done that I include in my book. And they've recently been looked at again, very recently, and they are very robust studies. So it's worth people having a look at those. But whether you choose to medicate a child, I think what you have to do is, like I've said before, it's even more important that you become a responsible, informed person in terms of what these drugs do. We live in the age of the consumer. We have access to so much information online. We have access, I think we do something like 3.5 billion Google searches a day. We Google how to open a can, we Google ridiculous things. Why don't we take some responsibility and find out more about these drugs? We really need to start doing it. And I think times are changing, and I think people are starting to ask more and more questions, which can only be a good thing.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And I hope talking about these kind of things make it more acceptable. I certainly had no idea some of the effects these drugs have. I think let's talk about this suicidality that can occur with antidepressant use. And like you said, studies show that it is increased. And people, I think what happened in my head when I learned about that was what I just said was, well, aren't these people more inclined towards suicidal ideation to begin with? And how do you know it's the medication causing it, not just the person? But I think we should touch on akathisia a bit, which is a fairly common, it's listed in the rare side effects, but it's not particularly rare. So could we touch on that, what that is and what that looks like?
Okay, akathisia is, I call it the A word of antidepressants, because I think it's the word that everybody needs to understand if they start to take antidepressants. It's a neurological condition that can happen mostly when people start taking the drug, when they change dose, and when they stop taking the antidepressants. It can also happen with change of generics. So if you're suddenly given a drug that's a different make of drug, the bioequivalence can be anything between 80 and 120%. So
what?
You suddenly might go into involuntary withdrawal just by being given I think it's only something like 10% of drugs that are prescribed in the States now that are branded drugs.
I had no idea the dosages could be changed. That's so dangerous.
Yeah, it's not just the quality of the drugs. It's and I see now so many times that people who are given a different generic are almost going into what could be termed withdrawal.
Wow.
It's happening so much. Akathisia. People call it, how do I best describe it? And I wonder how your dad described it, but people call it the epitome of losing their mind, basically, because they are unable to control the thoughts that they have. It's not just that, it's also a physical restlessness. So a kind of inner turmoil and a physical restlessness. So people pace, they can't control their jerks, their movements. It's probably one of the most horrible conditions that anybody can find themselves in. And people commit suicide or die by suicide for two reasons when it comes to akathisia. So the first one is that they have no control over their mind, and their mind is literally telling them to kill themselves. The second is that it becomes so painful and so unbearable that they feel that they have no option. And this is the saddest part of antidepressants. If somebody is in that state, you've seen it yourself. It is basically like losing your mind. And it's horrible. And we really, really need more information, more education. There are some fantastic sites. So there's Akathisia 101, which is a continuing education program, which is free and is online. And anybody can go and do that. And there's an amazing organization called Akathisia Education. I think it's Akathisia Alliance for Education and Research, which is doing some fantastic work to try and make people more aware of this condition. The problem is that, again, people will, if they become akathisic, people will say, it's a relapse. Mm-hmm. He's mentally ill again. She's mentally ill again. It's her mania. It's her. The problem is that a lot of people think they have become psychotic. So a lot of first episode psychosis, as people call it, the first time they become psychotic, is actually akathisia. It's actually drug-induced. And I think this is, I would love, it's fantastic that you are someone like yourself is actually trying to create awareness. And I think if akathisia is one area that really, really needs to be explored, and people really need to understand the condition.
Yeah. And I would say Yeah, that was the worst thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've seen some pretty bad things. Like I've had sick family members. I've seen Alzheimer's. I've seen cancer. I've been through surgeries. That was the worst thing I've ever seen by far.
Yeah. And I think it's the worst thing because there is nothing that anybody can do. I have seen people who have Akathisia for 10 years, 12, who I seriously, their life has become basically unlivable. And this is, a lot of it is chronic brain impairment. And a lot of it is that their central nervous system has just become so damaged that without the drugs, they can't survive.
Yeah. So my dad's out of it, right? And his was bad. His was like some of the worst akathisia that specialists had ever seen. And it took us years to figure out how to get rid of it. And I'm not saying that I'm going to tell people what we did, but I'm not saying that this is what's going to work because there's no information out there. But low dose mirtazapine helped with, and so that did end, which was just a miracle. And then there are case studies on opiates, and people are scared of taking those because of the withdrawal, but there are case studies of that helping akathisia. And if you're dealing with somebody with akathisia, which can like manifest, like you said, like bipolar or schizophrenia manifest as, so it's misdiagnosed as that, getting those people more comfortable is highest priority, no matter what. This isn't something people can tolerate and live with. This is something that's so uncomfortable that they commit suicide. So it doesn't matter what you have to do, but if you can find something that helps, you just use it because those people are in a lot of pain. So there are case studies on opiates helping, and they helped Dad tremendously. And then the other thing we did, which is super controversial, but it's what helped me, is I'm on this extremely strict diet. So we got rid of all carbs. And if Dad isn't on this, his akathisia comes back, which is completely absurd. And it isn't recognized by the medical community, but that's what happens to me too. So we're not sure if it's permanent nervous system damage that's just provoked really easily or what's going on, but that's what helped us. But provoking, one of the reasons you don't want to suddenly stop taking your medication is you don't want to provoke akathisia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the testimonials in my book are, so many of them tell of people suffering from akathisia and how they coped with it and the actual pain and turmoil that they went through in their lives. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. But we need to learn about this. We really do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully people are learning. I know with benzodiazepine use, they put a black box warning on it in the last year or so, but it needs to be something that all medical professionals know so that they're not just saying, oh, this kid, like even with a kid who's really misbehaving and really depressed and really angry, which is a huge problem because you don't want to be around a kid like that. The kid's unhappy. Like I can understand having a difficult child who's unhappy, but trying to go the more natural route and fixing diet first and trying other things. Otherwise you can provoke some of these side effects that are fairly common. Do you know how common experiencing akathisia is for antidepressant use?
No, I don't have any statistics, but I know it's much more common than we realize. And as you say, it's very often misdiagnosed as something else. So it would at the moment, I think, be very difficult to get actual statistics. One of the things that really concerns me about akathisia is I talk a lot about in my book about vulnerability and how antidepressants make you very vulnerable and in lots and lots of situations. But one of the things that we're seeing is if a child is put on a drug, say at 12 years old, eventually that child becomes an adult. So they might go off to university. They might make decisions for themselves. They might say to themselves, I don't really want to take this drug anymore, or I don't. And if they are not informed, we are seeing so many young people who suddenly decide to stop taking their medication or change their medication, become have akathisia and commit and end up dying by suicide. And this is so common. And this is another of the areas we need key education, is to young people, to adolescents, to tell them that they really, really need to take responsibility for their own medication. They really, really need to understand that they cannot stop taking this suddenly. And so that transition between being a child and an adult, when somebody made that decision for you that you will go on that medication, suddenly you're responsible for it yourself. And unless you have the information there, unless you have been educated by your parents, you're suddenly in a very vulnerable place.
Yeah. It would be nice if, and this is something I think should be mandatory in America if this is possible, but people should be educated about this in high school. Like, the percentage of kids on medication is so high that this should be a mandatory course in high school. And it should say, hey, it should teach you about these mental disorders, what different medications are, and what the side effects can be and often are. I don't know if that's ever going to happen or how that would start, but the percentage of people on psychiatric medications, do you know what it is? Is it 1 in 5? Is it more than that in America?
1 in 4.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So 1 in 4. And that's just, like you said, increased because of the pandemic.
I think it's about 1 in 4, but I think we're still waiting for statistics, recent statistics to come out. Canada is actually, I tried to get statistics for Canada before I was speaking to you, but it is quite difficult to actually get up-to-date statistics for Canada.
Yeah, there are many things difficult about Canada right now.
But you have always been in, I think, in the top 5 countries in terms of antidepressant consumption.
Yeah. Do you have any idea why they're so much higher in the States versus other countries?
I think it's just that direct consumer advertising has got a huge role. Or obviously, if we're seeing adverts on TV, then we're going to walk into a doctor's surgery and ask for a drug. And there's been a lot of talk recently about, should direct consumer advertising be banned? And the answer is, of course it should, because it's a very bad way of educating people about medication, because all they're basically doing is selling it. It needs to stop, I think. I think there's only America and New Zealand that allow direct consumer advertising.
Yeah, that's insane. They don't allow that in Canada for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just the two. And it plays a huge part in the number of, I think I've got a section in my book actually, the number of antidepressant adverts that are on TV. It's crazy. They spend billions. And people are seeing these from a very young age, and they think it's just a natural thing to do, It's just a natural part of life. If you're not coping, you go and get a drug. You take the drug, and hey. But the problem is that, as you and your dad discovered, once you get to that point of struggling and you need help, there's nowhere to find it.
Yeah, other than, like you said, anecdotal reports from people online who are all desperate, trying to help each other, trying whatever might work. Yeah. It's a complete catastrophe. And the crazy thing was we went everywhere. Like, we talked to everybody, and everybody made it worse, basically, because it was just like, oh, add this on. Oh, it's this, oh, it's schizophrenia. Oh, it's bipolar, and even though we were aware, no, this is akathisia and this is the cause, what can we do? Nothing also worked. Like, the medications for akathisia that people are given are generally benzodiazepines. But if benzodiazepines are causing akathisia in the first place, then, like, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, but again, it's all about people thinking that they have to rebalance, which is basically what they do have to do. But that's not the help that people want. People want help with the actual medication that they're taking. It's quite crazy in the States. If you look and if you Google antidepressant withdrawal, you'll find some very luxurious places that are willing to relieve you of tens of thousands of dollars to get rid of your antidepressant problem in weeks.
Yeah.
They can't do it. They just cannot do it. It's not a problem that can be solved in weeks. It's a problem that most of the time takes people years to do it successfully and without any harm. But people are buying into the fact that they think most of them are illicit drug or alcohol rehabilitation places, but most people are buying to the fact that if they have the money, let's give it a try. It needs to stop.
Yep, I agree. Okay, do I have more? I think we covered most of the things I wanted to talk about. Is there anything you want to talk about specifically other than what we've already covered?
I think I would love to talk more about the generic concept, because I think that is a really interesting thing that people need to know about. So if we take Prozac, is this okay if I talk about this?
Yeah. Let's do that.
If we take Prozac as an example, so I think Prozac was in the States, was launched in 1988, and it lost its patent in 2001. So then fluoxetine, the generic name, the drug could be made by any pharmaceutical company that wants to make it. So they basically apply for what is called an ANDA, so it's an abbreviated new drug application. So they send that off to the FDA, and the FDA looks at it, and they don't actually, the easiest way for me to describe it is they don't get the recipe for Prozac. So they don't see how Eli Lilly actually made Prozac. They don't. So all they have to do, I can see it first, all they have to do is prove similarity.
Wow.
Okay, so that's all they have to do. They have to prove the drug its effects are similar. So we are now having drugs from India, from China, from very little regulation over where these drugs are made. There's very little control over the quality of these drugs. There are some excellent books. Actually, if you're going to put some resources on this, I'd love to send you some things that I can.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. And especially the Akathisia site. So they have to prove that the drugs are similar. That's all they have to do. So every time you fill a prescription, nowadays, you might be getting a different make of drug every time you get a new prescription, a new script. So we can go from 80% bioequivalence to 120%, back to 80, back to 120. The quality of the ingredients might be different. And this is one of the things that is making patients really, really vulnerable. Because especially if they're trying to withdraw, so imagine you're trying to withdraw, and you're not being given the same drug every time, it makes it really difficult. Really, really difficult. So generics in terms of antidepressants are presenting a huge problem.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I didn't know that. Because then I don't think anybody knows that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we really need to start doing more research on, and we really start looking at. It's really important that if people are withdrawing, they try and take the same drug all the time, but it's impossible because of the availability of drugs. I mean, especially at the moment, every time somebody, I don't know whether I would imagine it's even worse in Canada and North America, but every time in the UK somebody goes and fills the script, then they're basically getting a different drug.
Wow. Okay.
It's interesting. Very interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. You'd think I mean, people automatically assume that everything in the world is just set up more properly than it is. So it's like, oh yeah, the pharmacist asks you, do you want this brand or do you want the generic brand? It's cheaper. And so your assumption is, well, they're the same, but one's cheaper. And I don't need something fancy. It's like brand name clothing, right? Who cares? It's like, oh no, they don't even make it the same way necessarily.
But it's back to that issue that, we have to appreciate that we are consumers. We are consumers of these drugs and we are paying for them. Whether it be through insurance, whether it be tax, we are paying for them and we deserve to get the quality drugs that we should get.
I agree. Okay, Beverley, thank you very much for coming on. I'll link your book below, but for everybody listening, can you just reiterate what your book is and where to find you online?
Yeah, sure. My book is called Antidepressed. It's a breakthrough examination of antidepressant harm and dependence. And what I've done is I've written a book that is, as I call it, in plain language. It's not a medical book. It's not an academic book. It's a book so that people can become informed users of antidepressants. I haven't said in the book that people should not take these drugs. What I've said in the book is if they take them, they need to know about the harms and the benefits of the drug. Okay. So where they can find me, I am at TAP Support, TAP Support on Twitter. I am at Med Consulting, and I will give you a couple of sites that you can put in the links.
That would be great. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming on.
No, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you. It's been really interesting and it's lovely to meet you.